All right,
Okay,
welcome
we're
to,
ready.
all right. Welcome to the Community of Scholars event, sponsored by the College of Liberal Arts at USI and hosted by Social Work and Center for Social Justice. Before we begin today's presentation by Dr. Addy, I would like to introduce our Assistant Dean, Dr. Crystalline Sheffland. Dr. Sheffland.
Thank you, Marie. We are thrilled to be able to have this conversation today. As the assistant dean, one of the assistant deans of the College of Liberal Arts, I'm also the chair of our Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee. And inclusion is about creating an environment that is welcoming and accessible and actively promotes well-being, where individuals are represented on a learning continuum, that our students and our faculty and our staff have a space that builds community where we're able to have a voice connected to broader challenges outside of the university, within the region and within the nation. And having a conversation about building inclusive classrooms is such an important component to our process here at USI. And we are thrilled to have Tracie Addy here to speak with us today.
Thank you, Dr. Sheffland. Now, I would like to introduce Dr. Tracie Addy, Associate Dean of Teaching and Learning at Lafayette College. Dr. Addy, could you tell us a little bit about yourself before you start your presentation?
Absolutely. So I oversee the Center for Teaching and Learning at Lafayette College. So a lot of my day, basically surrounds working with faculty members and supporting them and partnering them on their teaching efforts. And so that's how I spend most of my time. And I do a lot of scholarship around teaching and learning. So we have been able to produce some really good resources, and we're going to keep going. And so those include our first book, What Inclusive Instructors Do, and I'll be doing some highlights from that today. And then also our book that's actually coming out, next book in March of 2024, which is furthering that conversation around inclusive teaching. So I am very excited to be able to join you today, and I'm going to share my screen here so that you can follow along with some of the things that I will tell you today. So inclusive teaching in general is just something that's so critical in higher education. I'm so glad that now we're also just spending so much time and really thinking about how to build more inclusive classroom spaces. And I also want to make sure you can see my screen. So hopefully you can see my screen today. Hopefully thumbs up. Can you see my screen? Just to check.
I see you.
You see me. Okay, so let me try that again. Let me share my screen again. I think it's not behaving today. Okay, here we go. So inclusive teaching is just something that, is so valuable in higher education. We sometimes think about what is good teaching, and really good teaching is inclusive teaching. It really should be integrated throughout all that we do, from the design of our course to the pedagogy, that we utilize. So it is a critical thing, and it should be at every level of teaching and learning, higher ed all the way throughout. So the first thing I like to do sometimes when I start off one of these types of talks is just have a time of reflection. And I will, during this talk, have various moments where we will interact. I like interactivity. I'm a big fan of it. So just think about a time when you felt as if you either did or did not belong, or were not treated equitably. Okay, so we can all think about a time like this, right? Because belonging is so critical. It's a human need. And we can probably think of, maybe some of us have stories of times when we weren't treated equitably, right? When we didn't feel as if we belong. So what we're going to do today is we're going to turn that, perspective and think about our learners and think about when they feel like they don't belong, or when they feel like they're not treated equitably, and think about us as instructors and how we can actually create classrooms where we can actually have spaces where students feel as if they belong. So what I'm going to talk about first is just the critical importance of inclusion. Then next, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work we've done with mindset and the work I've done with partnering with instructors, where we think about, like, how do they think about inclusive teaching? What are their mindsets, the frameworks that they approach it through, and the lenses in which they see it through? We'll get a little bit of, on the ground of like what inclusive instructors do, some of the practices that we see. Of course, inclusive teaching encompasses so many things, but we will talk about a couple of examples and highlight the voices of instructors. So that's what our book, What Inclusive Instructor does. We'll also talk about how to visualize inclusive teaching. One of my most recent efforts has been really to focus on what does inclusive teaching look like? And we've developed, actually in partnership with students, an observation protocol that we've been using for the last few years to give instructors feedback on their inclusive teaching efforts. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and then also have you kind of look at and view a couple of the video clips that we've created where instructors are engaging in such approaches. And then lastly, we'll conclude on the rewards and benefits, why this stuff is so important. I'll tie it into some of the research and some of the work I've done and what we've seen emerge, from this wonderful instruction that is effective teaching. So first, I'm going to just operationalize my terms. We could all kind of define inclusive teaching how we define it, but I'll say that what I'm talking about today is those practices that are equitable. So we're thinking equity and not equality. We're ensuring that we know that there are differences between students, and we're using practices that acknowledge those differences. And they promote a sense of belonging for a diversity of learners. One of our huge missions in higher education is to support a diverse student population and their growth and development and transformation. So these are practices that are really going to support all of our students. And of course, these practices are critical. And when students see that you do them, and this is the beauty of what's coming out actually in our next work, is that they show that to them that they are valued and that they matter. So that's the inclusive teaching that I'm going to be talking about today. So why is inclusive teaching so important in higher education? I've already kind of expressed some initial thoughts around this, and I'm sure you all, can absolutely express why this is so important. If we actually look at some of the research, we're going to see a lot of different studies that show just how critical it is to feel as if you belong in college. We're going to see it linked to progression, right, in college, and we're going to see it differentially affect students from various social identities and backgrounds. And so here's just a couple of studies, and some of them have been like kind of foundational, and others, just general studies that have really explored these questions. Some of the studies, like this one here, they've done interventions where they actually looked at the difference between students who they actually did a psychological intervention where they actually told them, very early on, these were undergraduate students, and when they got to the college, that you will, face some trials, and you'll find your people eventually. You'll kind of get through it. And they actually tracked those students through their college years, and they found actually they had better outcomes than their control group students. And these students were students that identified as Black students. And it's so amazing that, belonging was this amazing psychological lever. They did this very small intervention that made a big impact. We'll also see, some of these national studies that look across first generation students, many other students of various identities, and look at their perspectives of belonging. And we know that they vary, right? They vary at many of our institutions. In addition, some of the actual tying it to teaching types of studies have emerged where we're actually using inclusive teaching pedagogies, and we're seeing that students can actually, or the achievement of students actually is better. So we're seeing reduction of these equity gaps that can happen between students of various identities. We see belonging is critical even in graduate school, professional school, right? So these ideas of the hidden curriculum, graduate students' sense of belonging, although there are some elements of it that are a little bit different in terms of what, increases belonging for graduate students. These are real, and they're actually going to impact their success and their achievement. And then these are a couple of more studies. So we know that belonging matters, and it matters to students. It matters to students across all levels. And we can also think about the types of interventions that actually work, that make a difference. And so that's why we're going to be centering on inclusive teaching. So what I'd like to do next, and like I said, I like to have this interactive. I like to get your engagement. So we're going to actually do a poll. And I'm going to put the link in the chat to this poll to make it a little easier. So what I'd like you to do is to basically tell us in this space, in this virtual space, and let's put this here in the chat. Here's the link. What inclusivity challenges you have seen your students face with regards to their learning. So you can use the link in the chat. You can also go to menti.com and enter the code. I also put the QR code just in case you wanted to scan it or something like that from a phone. So I gave you 3 different ways you could get into the poll. Now do let me know if the poll is not working, but I think I activated it. So I'll give you a minute or so. Try to answer that poll. What inclusivity challenges have you seen your students face with regards to their learning? So we're still waiting for some responses. So I'm hoping that someone will respond to the poll. So if, again, you can put some different inclusivity challenges there that you've seen your students face, because we really want to make this really focused on thinking about the students at your institution, the students that you teach, right? The students that come to your classrooms as well. So I'll give you a couple of more seconds. I did see that some are coming in, so great. You can respond more than once to the poll. So if you have a couple of ideas, feel free to share several different ideas with regards to the inclusivity challenges. Excellent. All right, I see more and more coming in. Very good. All right, so I'm going to share the things that you have shared. So students with disabilities, okay, yeah. So how do students with disabilities, how do we set up environments that help them thrive, right? You know, what types of needs do they have that we can ensure, you know, so that they can be successful? I also see actual reading of a textbook has become an accessibility issue. Yeah, reading, you know, it's interesting because now, you know, there's so many different forms of how students get information, and textbook reading, right, is one form, and sometimes that can be a challenge. We can also, I don't know what this one, what was meant completely by this one, but potentially also thinking about, should it be online, should it not be, how much the textbook costs, like all of these types of issues can be challenges. Faculty buy-in, yeah, absolutely. So that can be really challenging, right, as well, to work with our colleagues who really, you know, aren't invested in this type of work. And so we'll talk a little bit more about those barriers and those challenges that we can face and how we can move that forward. I see sexual, gender identity, political differences. Yeah, especially now, similar life experiences as classmates, jobs, absolutely. All those competing things, right, that competing priorities that our students have. No interactions with non-white people before college. Yeah, absolutely. So if we grow up and we've only interacted or seen people that looked and acted just like us, that's going to be really hard, right? We need to go through some transformation and understanding to grow our own cultural understanding and cultural development. So faculty who do not see the value in making courses accessible, okay, and assuming that there are no socioeconomic troubles, absolutely. There's so many assumptions that can happen with inclusion that are just challenging and problematic. And I'll talk to you a little bit about some of the ways we've been trying to navigate that in terms of building inclusive classroom spaces. One of the things that we've been actually doing is using the Who's in Class form to actually put up front some of the diversity and honoring that diversity of students and what they bring to the classroom very early on, so that we can talk about it, we can address it. And I also see age and experience. Thank you so much for engaging with me in that poll. So the challenges that your students face are just like challenges that are faced across, institutions in the United States and beyond. So these are some common challenges. Now let's transition a little bit into mindset. So when we actually did our investigation of inclusive instructors, what we really wanted to get a sense of was, how do they approach this? What are their mindsets? What are their frameworks in which they view teaching and learning? So I'll share some of those with you. So first, really critical to them is knowing who their learners are. So this idea of who is in my class, what are they bringing to my class, and how can I use that information to build a more inclusive classroom environment? So you'll see inclusive instructors, they're going to do a lot of different activities to get to know their students because they know that's important. It's not like, I just come to class, I teach. It doesn't matter who's sitting in the space or who's online with me, right? I want to know those people and I want to know how to best teach them. So that's one. Another thing we see is that they recognize diversity as an asset. So there are these deficit models of higher education. When there's more diversity, they're not going to do as well, et cetera. And it's tied to all these negative things and very deficit-minded frameworks. Our inclusive instructors, they actually see that diversity as an asset. So their frameworks are a little bit different. In addition, they see the importance of affirmation. So making sure that they affirm students and that they're really aware of students of varying identity types that can be vulnerable to various types of concerns, whether it is stereotype threat, which is this phenomenon that some groups might underperform if they have a prevailing stigma against them of their intelligence or something of that nature. They've done a lot of interesting studies have come out on that. Claude Steele, many others have done great research around that. And so they're really thinking about these types of issues and how important that affirmation is. Some of our students have never received that, and it's powerful. It can be very powerful for students. They take ownership in addition. So they say, no, it's not just the Office of Diversity Inclusion's issue to think about inclusion, diversity, it's mine. And in my classroom, right, I take ownership over that. And maybe I can't do everything in terms of solving all the problems, right, of diversity and inclusion, but there's a power that I have in my classroom to build a space that is inclusive for all of my learners. So they're really thinking in that way. In addition, they're thinking about intentionality around their course designs. So they know that I need to start first with my course and how it's designed, whether it's the content, how I design my pedagogy, etc. All of that's critical. I need to be intentional about it. I'm not just going to tack it on at the end of my class session. I have to think about this very much so throughout. And then lastly, another thing we really see is that they're looking holistically. They're really thinking about the entire student. They want to teach the whole student, right? They're thinking about those students, as you mentioned in your poll, that might, have challenges with the textbook, or that might work a variety of different jobs that can impact the way in which they engage in that class. So they're thinking about that, and they're trying to figure out, how can I teach the students so in the end, they can accomplish the goals of that particular course. So those are some of the mindsets of inclusive instructors. What I'd like you to do, if you could share in the chat, again, I love engagement. Which mindsets of these most resonate with your work on inclusive teaching, or where you desire to be? What are the ones that, I've mentioned of these types that really resonate with you? So if we could take a minute and share in the chat. And again, there's no one right answer. All of these are really important and good mindsets to have. And we might see that some of them to us resonate a little bit more than others. So if you could share kind of your thoughts, we're going to take a different approach and try to use the chat this time. Which ones resonate with you most? And I'll give you a minute to kind of collect your thoughts. Oh, the chat is disabled. Okay, so if the chat is disabled, then are we able to actually enable the chat? Thank you for letting us know. Can we enable the chat? That would be fabulous if we could. So for now, though, while we're kind of enabling it, Can you please just think about that? Which of those mindsets are most resonant to you? And we'll move on, and we'll try to maybe use the chat at a later point. So thank you. Okay, so one of the things in my work on inclusive teaching that I definitely see is that there are lots of myths that surround it. I'll present to you here 4, but you can probably think a lot of, of other myths in addition to the ones that I talk about today. So the first myth I see is that inclusive teaching is like this thing where I have to water down everything to make it easier for my students. I have to lower my expectations. And so nothing within our inclusive teaching, kind of practices and how we promote it is really about lowering our expectation. In fact, we really do need to challenge our students. They're there in our classrooms so that they can learn and grow. It should be a challenging experience in some way for them, right? It should transform their thinking or their ways of doing, their attitudes, etc. So inclusive teaching is not about watering things down. And I always want to kind of nail that. The other thing that comes out is that I can only do it in some disciplines and I can in others. So, these disciplines, yeah, they can do that, but we can't, in our discipline. And so what I would say to that is actually, I work with instructors across disciplines. Inclusive teaching is a broad topic. There's so many ways to do it. And so many ways to do it in a variety of courses, from the small steps you take from just learning your students' names, right? And engaging them in different ways and building relationships, to larger steps such as revising or revamping your curriculum in different ways. So this is something that we all can do. And so it would be a myth to say that none of us can do that, some of us can't do this work. Some would also say I see this not possible in large courses. Now, large courses will always be different than small classes. The dynamic will always be different when you have more people in a space and you're trying to learn and teach and learn in those spaces. However, we have various ways that we can engage students inclusively in large classes, and we see it. We've seen studies around this too. We see them decreasing equity gaps by our pedagogies, like active learning. If we do it well, we know that can actually decrease equity gaps in large classes, small classes. The Who's in Classroom that I'll talk about a little later, that one can be used in classrooms of all sizes. We can use name tents, for example, to help us call on our students by their names. There's some research to suggest that even the name tents and calling students using those is important to them, right? So these are all meaningful things that we can do no matter our class size. It might differ a little bit in how we implement it. Some things might not be possible, but we can still do this. And then lastly, that all practices are time intensive. I will say that just doing some of the smallest things can actually make a really big difference. And our students have told us that. I work actually very closely with student fellows. We have several in our center, and they work on inclusive teaching. They do observation, they give feedback, they do all kinds of things. And some of the things that they give feedback on are things that are really small scale. They're not like really time intensive. So these are the myths, some of the myths on inclusive teaching that I always like to debunk. And of course, like I said, you can probably think of others. So now let's move on in our journey and think about what inclusive instructors do. So we've already framed this conversation today with why this is so important. Why is inclusive teaching so important, right? And then we talked about, well, some of the mindsets that inclusive instructors have, and our mindsets can lead to the things that we actually enact and do in our classrooms. So I'm just going to show you through a series of kind of voices of different instructors from one of our studies, what types of things inclusive instructors do. So the first thing is thinking about inclusive course design. So let's look at this quote here. I've rewritten my syllabus to be more inclusive, including a section on how to get help, a section on what office hours means, and in general, have demystified many aspects of the syllabus. So starting with the syllabus, and the syllabus can be a tool for many things, we can actually think about how we create that syllabus and even the content in it, going beyond what this quote says, in a way that's inclusive. So this particular instructor is really thinking about who's in their class, an instructor thinking about how do my students get help, because, making sure that they have the resources that they need. What office hours means, we know that some students might not interpret them to mean what we think they mean. You know, sometimes we'll call them student hours to make sure students aren't confused about like them not coming during that time or not getting support. And then also just demystifying aspects of the syllabus. So this is the first step, right? To really think about who's in class and to actually start to think about our syllabus as a way and as a tool to actually support all of our learners. And we could go a step further. We can look at the content of our syllabus, right? We can look at, does it have material that resonates with our learners? Does it relate to their identities, their backgrounds, their experiences? Does it build off of what they're bringing? Does it allow opportunities for our students to pull in their backgrounds as well and their experiences, right? So some of the content and some of the assignments, et cetera, that we engage in. Another thing we see inclusive instructors do is give students the tools for success. And that's kind of in the first quote a little bit too, in thinking, you know, carefully about, well, students, you know, are they getting the resources that they need to support their actual success? Thank you so much for engaging the chat. So look at this quote. Inclusive teaching is creating a welcoming environment for all students, having high expectation with support for students who need it to be successful, differentiating content, presentation, and learning activities, and options for demonstrating mastery. So there's a lot to say about this particular quote. So first off, it's really thinking about the entire class, right? So all of my students, I'm thinking about them. This instructor is thinking about them. We also see the high expectation, right? So this idea that we are not watering things down so that students can be successful. And then we're also thinking about our content and how we present, as well as giving students options. So this idea that students can practice is a good thing for mastery. Some students who haven't had prior experiences need that practice, right, to get to our goals in the end. So many low stakes opportunities is also going to be really important. In addition, they intentionally create a welcoming classroom. This one refers to online teaching, but we can apply it beyond. Provide a welcome statement with a positive tone. Provide many resources for students who have technical difficulties. Welcome alternate views and online discussions. Course ground rules for discussions. So all of these things are creating a classroom climate that's more welcoming for students, right? And so that's really important for our learners, right? And that's important for them to be able to thrive at our institutions. They also will employ foundational inclusive teaching concepts and practices. So this particular quote talks about structuring those major assignments with benchmarks. Sometimes what can happen is we assume we're just going to give this assignment, we're focusing on the product. But in reality, what is really needed in many cases, unless students have a lot of experience doing this work, you know, depending on their backgrounds, but to actually have those benchmarks to help keep students on track, to give them opportunities for feedback, to have those expectations so that they recognize, you know, what's expected of them. So not every student knows that information, right? And so we also just want to make sure we're equitably kind of distributing that particular knowledge. All right. Another thing we see is that they're engaging with their students inclusively. So we talked a little bit about course design. We talked a little bit about like how they're scaffolding the assignments, but we also see that they try to also engage with their learners in inclusive ways. So this particular example says, I go about this by generating activities throughout the semester to find out more about my student audience, their career interests, their misconceptions, how their cultural, geographical, and generational experiences inform their own interests, their perceptions of future career goals, their self-evaluation. So they're actually creating these environments where they're engaging with students to get to know them a little better, right, inclusively. Again, this is a holistic approach to teaching. And then the last thing I'll say until we move into some more examples is they get feedback. Inclusive instructors get feedback. They hear student voice. So seeking that mid-quarter, mid-course, mid-semester feedback about how they're building an inclusive classroom is going to be really important for them. So if we actually think about this a little bit more, I'd like you to think about this. And I'm guessing the chat might not still be working. Some said it might, may not be. So if we can't, get the chat working, that's okay. But think about which inclusive teaching approaches you have found to be successful. Which ones have you found? These were a couple that I just I discussed with regards to our study, but which ones have you found? So oftentimes when I interact and work with instructors, what I find is that, they're like, I'm doing some of them are like, I'm doing some of these things. And the things that we talk about, they're like, I can add more, right, into my particular repertoire. So what I'm going to do next is now we're going to move into visualizing inclusive teaching. And you can always keep me posted on if you get the chat to work at any point. Okay, great. The chat is now working. So now that the chat is working, let's try it out. And I'd like you to, if you could post some inclusive teaching approaches that you use so far. I'd like to see if we could spend a minute just thinking about your approaches and some of the things that you do in your classes. So share in the chat. Great. I see asking for pronouns and preferred names up front. Absolutely. So asking students, their pronouns is really important, and asking them what do they want to be called, right? And that's always the best option to go, knowing what that student wants to be called. So thank you so much for sharing that. Are there any other practices that you use as well? Inclusive teaching practices. Ask what content they want me to focus on. Great. So you're getting the input from your students, and then you can actually move into doing, designing the environment that's supportive and aligns with some of the things they're interested in. Ask what they want to learn from the course. Absolutely. Having accurate captions on everything. Very good. Yeah. So keeping things very accessible for students is also very important for our learners. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm so glad that we got the chat working. Okay, so now let's take it another notch and let's start talking about what does this look like? What do these inclusive teaching approaches look like? So I mentioned earlier in my talk that we developed a protocol, and it's a classroom observation protocol called the Protocol for Advancing Inclusive Teaching Efforts. It's called the PATE. And the reason why we created this protocol is because there was nothing like it out there that really gave an instructor formative, very low stakes feedback on the various inclusive teaching approaches they were using. Now, we focused on approaches in this protocol that were very much so reliable. So we actually did a whole kind of research study on it. We had 2 observers. We determined the reliability, of the different codes and things like that they observed. And so these are all research supported inclusive teaching practices. And I've been using this with instructors, and it's been really wonderful to kind of get a sense of how they've used it. They always feel like, wow, that's a lot of interesting information about my teaching that I've never seen in that way before. So I'm going to give you some of the sample codes here that the observer will look out for. One of them is prior knowledge assessment. So does the instructor start with what students already know and try to understand what they already know? And so that's really important for learning, because we know that the science of learning says if we start here, our students are here, that's not going to work, right? We need to start with what they already know. Do they use diverse examples? Are they using a variety of visuals and media, from slides, videos, captions, all of that kind of thing? Are they doing relationship building? And that actually should be REL, relationship building. Do we see them doing that in their class? So we'll start to kind of generate these visualizations for them. Sometimes it'll be a pie chart or tables and things like that. And they'll get a sense of how frequently they're using some of these approaches. And that's just an example. Another couple, and this has 15 codes. So community standards. Do they reference standards for how to create an inclusive classroom, or how they want to facilitate that inclusive classroom? And those standards could be co-created with students, but are they referencing them? Is there equitable participation? Are the majority of students engaged in that activity? Is there active learning? Are they using these active learning strategies? So those are some of the codes that we'll see for this particular protocol. Now, what we've done is a step forward, and we've built a site, and it's called inclusiveteachingvisualization.com, but I hope to build out even more. but you can always go to this site. And this site is a tool for many things. So first, you can look at these vignettes that we've produced and reflect on your own teaching around inclusion. Second, it actually serves as a tool to help train people on using the protocol and using the videos to really capture inclusive teaching practices. So what we're going to do next is we're going to look at two very short vignettes. They're only a couple minutes. And so what I'd like you to do is to pick out the different inclusive teaching approaches that you might see and share them in the chat. Okay, so I'm just going to actually just make sure right now that I'm sharing my sound. So I might have to stop my share for a minute. And I'm going to share my sound and I'm going to share my screen. And so again, I'd like you just to be able to think about what inclusive teaching approaches you see, okay, as well. All right, so share sound, although I don't know if this button is not working. So I'm going to try it and I'm going to see if you can hear it. So tell me in the chat if you hear this. Do you hear this? No? Okay, all right, so let me try that again. It's not enabling me to share for some reason. I'm not sure why. Let's see. Yeah, when I click share screen, it's not enabling. So what I'll do instead is you all can also view this yourselves too. So what I'm going to do is actually put the link in the chat, and I'm going to give you a moment to basically be able to share, to actually look at the video yourself and then just get a sense. And I can play it too, but I'd like you to look at it. I might need the host, since I'm not a host, Marie, I might need you to share it in the chat because it will not allow me, or Sherry, I just sent it to you. It will not allow me to put the link in the chat to share to everybody. So if you could share that to everyone, that link that I just put, that'd be great. Thank you very much. Excellent. So spend a few, a second, it's only like 2 minutes. Yes, I tried to click the share sound button, but it's not enabling it. I don't know why it's not doing that right now. So, but try to see if you can watch this video clip, and I'd like to get a sense of what you take from it. Yes, and you shouldn't be able to hear it because there's no sound. So Sherry put the link in the chat. I'm just playing it, but please play it on your own computers. I don't know if my sound's not enabled since I'm not a host or whatever, but I'm not able to share my sound. Okay, so I'm going to come out of that and I see some responses in the chat. So basically, inclusive teaching approaches in that particular example, the students are working in a group and they are trying to learn this, how blood passes through the heart, complicated, kind of, concept principles. And so the instructor is moving over to the students after they've, kind of practiced and basically is, seeing how they did, how is it going? And so I see lots of good things in the chat around inclusivity, work with the group. Yeah, so active learning, we know that can decrease equity gaps. So that's an inclusive teaching approach, right? You can see images, absolutely. So in the actual video, there were not only models, there were like 2D images, there were other models. So there's a variety of diverse visuals that the students had, including physical kind of models. There's also the praise. Yeah, so there's affirmation there, right? The instructor was praising the student when they were actually demonstrating how blood passes through the heart, etc. And so that was another thing. And then also, yes, you caught that, name tense. So the students did have name tense, and they had their pronouns written on the name tense too. You can have those students write their pronouns. You can even have them write the phonetic spelling of their names so that you can pronounce them correctly as well. And then I also see active learning. Excellent. Good, good. Okay, excellent. So that is one example of thinking about how do we visualize this inclusive teaching. Now, that particular video shows a bunch of different things in it, right? So this might be spread out upon, many different many different aspects of a classroom session. So thank you for engaging in that with me. So what I'm going to do next is we're going to move on. Just close that out. And what I'd like to do now is we're not going to look at the next one, but you can look at it on your own time. I'm going to share the slides with you so you can feel free to always explore the Inclusive Teaching Visualization Project more. But what I'd like to do, because I'd like to also get to some time if there's questions and things like that, is talk about the rewards and benefits. So why do we do this work on inclusion? So one of the things and one of the ways in which we've seen the benefits is through some of the tools and some of the research that we've done around inclusive teaching to kind of tease out what impact are these things making on our students, on our learners. And so one of the tools that we created was the Who's in Class form. I'll give you the slides to this presentation. You can always go to the references. It's open access too. It's also in our book, but it's also open access in an article. But this was a tool that was used and designed and co-created with students to very early on in a course understand that diversity of learners, right? That the instructor had in their course. And so our instructors will use this tool, and then we'll also talk to them about what they see and how they can tweak their course to be even more inclusive after using it. So here's some of the example questions. And for our purposes, instructors can do this a variety of ways, but because of some of the questions on there, we do hold it anonymous if they do the whole tool, but some instructors might choose to pull out some questions that are not anonymous, so that they can identify students, because sometimes you do for certain things. But our students did tell us that certain questions you ask, we don't feel comfortable, if we don't know the instructor, we're not going to answer those questions anyway, if you ask them in a non-anonymous way. So you can see I work on or off campus, how many hours I work. I have a laptop or desktop computer. I'm financially capable of purchasing the materials. I'm a first-gen student. And these questions like my expectations for inclusivity. So those are a sample of some of them. And you can access the entire form to kind of get a sense of it. So basically, the instructor will administer this at the beginning of class. And we usually recommend set aside time. Tell students why you're doing it. And then some of our instructors will actually say, I'm going to take the aggregate and share it back. So they'll let them know in advance. And then they'll say, this is who's in our class, right? And they'll share some things that are not private or confidential, but overall aggregate kind of information, especially in a larger class. In a smaller class, you have to be careful. If it's too small, I wouldn't suggest, kind of doing this type of thing for some of the types of questions asked. So what we ended up doing was we asked the students and the instructors for their feedback on this form. And so we asked the students, and 90% of them felt comfortable, some to strong agreement. 80% of them recommended that their other instructors use it. And 81% felt like it was a good opportunity to really share anonymous information that they wouldn't normally have shared. And so some of the things you'll see on this form, you might not even get from your students, outside of it. So they'll share lots of interesting things on this particular form. For example, maybe they'll share, some of them will share maybe I have ADHD, or I have trouble with anxiety in groups and things like that. They might share things like that. And the instructor always has to have that discernment. We do say, delete this form at the end of the semester. This is private. Students volunteer to write this information. They have complete control over whether they choose not to include and what they choose to include on this form. We also asked instructors who used the form if they felt it was helpful, would they recommend others used it, would they implement it again, and if it helped them be more inclusive. So you can see some of the results from that particular part of the study. In the end, and I'll say that this form has led to a lot of interesting things. So, for example, with instructors, they'll be like, I didn't know my students worked so much, or I didn't realize, like, I shouldn't be doing this in my class, or maybe this won't be good for them. So they've really gone through a reflective process after finding out lots of this information on their students that has caused them to kind of tweak their course to make it more inclusive. And although it's not included here, there's so much more I could say about this form. But some of the students were like, oh, I really appreciate it. I felt like the instructor cared, and they really felt like more than a number, right, in that particular course. In addition, so I wanted to bring up to you, and we'll be publishing on this hopefully soon, some of our Inclusive Instructors Academy. So we've been running this for like 5 or 6 cohorts, where it's basically an academy focused on inclusion. So our instructors will come in with inclusive teaching goals. We'll work with them on those, or we'll hone them, but thinking like student sense of belonging, trying to increase that, making it more equitable for students of color, students with disabilities, designing assignments that increase students' awareness of systemic racism, equitable, transparent assignment design. Those are just some of the different types of things they've explored and more, those who participated. So what we found is we did a longer term kind of investigation where we asked 1 to 2 years out, are they still using these techniques? What have been the students' responses to what they did through the academy? Because it's like a very live, real-time experience. They propose, they do it during the academy, they're actively teaching, they get feedback on it, they also get paired with a student partner. And so lo and behold, we see so much positivity, right? The students are still very positive. They see that the instructor really supports them, that it was thoughtful. It helped them understand the expectations, especially when they increase the transparency of their assignments, and so much more. So there's been a lot of good, positive things that can come out of whatever types of goals you have, right, around inclusion, if you're doing it in ways that can support student success. So I always like to share this too. This is a letter from a student to a professor that they gave me permission to share. This particular student just talked about how kind they were, and that they really appreciated that particular professor and how much of a great teacher in person they were. They really appreciated some of the inclusive strategies that they talked about in their class. So it's all de-identified. So there's so many benefits to this. So we have to do it, right? We have to build these inclusive classrooms. But the challenge is sometimes we have these barriers that we face. And so what do we do with those? So we also did an investigation of the major barriers that instructors felt like held them back from doing this work. And we found that they came in a couple of categories. There were personal ones and there were institutional ones. So personally, they felt like they weren't aware of like what's inclusive teaching, which is another reason we wrote, thinking about writing the book and giving all these resources on how can you be an inclusive instructor. They also felt like sometimes that they weren't aware, or some instructors weren't aware that the students had all this diversity in class that they needed to teach differently. So awareness came in kind of 2 dimensions. Fear, they didn't want to mess up. They didn't want to offend their students. Unwillingness to change their practice. They just like, well, I've been doing this for a while. It's going well. Why should I change? They didn't feel responsible, right? This came up in our mindset, right? When I talked about mindset of inclusive instructors, they feel responsible. So one of the things that came up here is that it's just not my job to build an inclusive classroom. I'm just there to teach. But lo and behold, what I'm saying here is that to teach is to build, right, an inclusive classroom. So they are connected. And then also what comes up is, how do I help when students are not being inclusive to each other? So it's not like it's me, but it's really, not building an inclusive classroom. It's really the student interactions that are challenging. Other barriers were not having that support administratively from others. They didn't feel like there's an incentive to do it. Why should I do this and spend so much time when there's no incentive in my institution? It's not all these isms, racism, sexism happening. How are we supposed to do this stuff if these things are so prevalent, right, in our institution? And then we just don't talk about it. So this is why these types of sessions are wonderful, because we're talking about it. We're raising these topics in general. So those particular barriers are things that some of our instructors we know are facing in terms of thinking about, well, how do I move forward in this approach? But we do know that supports matter more than barriers, and some of the research that has come out on that. And so we can talk about fear, but we're going to all make mistakes. And so if we frame it as, this is not our continual journey, this is a continual journey. This is gonna help us, right? Really think about it. We're gonna make mistakes sometimes, but we're gonna try to do our best and we're gonna keep learning and growing, just like our students. It is time to change, especially if we've been using outdated techniques. It's time to understand what inclusive teaching is about, right? And it is our responsibility to build these interactions. And then for student-student interactions, we can think about ways in which we set up the classroom environment to promote an inclusive space, whether through those collaborative guidelines, through addressing problems that happen in the classroom, etc. All of those types of things. And of course, we need our institutions behind us on this. We need to actually talk about it. We need to have incentives to do this work, right? And we need to work on ourselves, like in a variety of ways. So we also saw a lot in this study of ways that we can move forward. So I'd like you to kind of get a sense of this. Let's diversify our faculty and staff. We're going to work on our department level things, whether it's revising our curriculum, mentoring our students. We're going to look at the data, right? We're going to see, are there gaps? Are there equity gaps? Are there places where students don't feel like they belong? What can we do better, right, for them? We're going to assess that. We're going to measure our impacts. You know, some of the work that we've been doing, we're trying to measure impact, the student outputs of belonging and also ultimately, you know, achievement as well. We're going to see our student supports. What are we putting together? And then all of those institutional things that we need to make, whether it's a commitment to it, putting resources towards it, right? Towards building more inclusive institutions, more inclusive spaces, or maybe it's that professional development that we need to, you know, move in that direction, and opportunities to talk about it, like this wonderful kind of event today. So now that we've gotten to that point and we're getting closer to time, so I'd like you to just reflect, what personal barriers, if any, do you face regarding inclusive teaching? How about institutional? How can supports play valuable roles? We know that, again, supports matter more than barriers. We're always going to have some barriers, likely, at least right now, but we can move through those. We can move past those, right, you know, kinds of barriers if we have the correct and proper supports. So think about that just for a second. All right. So as we start to conclude this session, I would love for you to do one more poll. So this particular poll it's going to be the same link as your first poll, and it's basically going to focus on, and I should be able to put this one in the chat, but this particular poll, and let me scroll down to it again, is thinking about next steps. And so I'll also have to have this particular poll link put in the chat. But what do you see as your next steps that you can take in your journey as an inclusive instructor? What do you want to see for yourself? You know, so try to see if you can, and if we can, again, put that in the chat for everybody, that would be fabulous. Thank you. And I'll give it to several people as well. So if you can put this in the chat, just send it to everybody in the chat window, that would be great. That's the link to this particular poll. You can also get there by going to menti.com and entering that code as well. Okay, so good. So somebody got to the poll. Let me make sure it's activated for the second question. And then you should be able to respond. So what do you foresee as your next steps as an inclusive instructor? Perfect, thank you. And then we'll do for the last few minutes Q&A after we discuss some of these next steps. And did we get the link in the chat, Marie or Sherry? Were you able to put that link in the chat for the Menti poll just so that people can access it quickly? Thank you. Perfect.
This is Marie. I wasn't able to, and I have asked Shari to do it.
Okay, thank you. Well, I see some coming in, so perfect.
Okay.
All right, so I see incorporate more of these practices in the classroom, continue learning and implementing strategies that promote inclusivity. Great. Continue to be intentional as well. I want to see more colloquiums such as this. Yes, that sounds great. Implement the survey, adjust the teaching approach from the answers. Great. Being open with students when implementing these strategies. Yeah, and so often being explicit to them is really helpful because then they see where you're coming from and what you're trying to do, right, with the class. Encourage our admin to support these efforts absolutely across the classroom and faculty. Excellent. Great. Thank you so much for sharing. Those are really, really good next steps. And so I'm going to also just put, if actually can also, Shari can also put this link in the chat and maybe that can be sent later to those who registered. But these are the slides. And I will say that these are references. You can always go back to some of these references. This is the protocol that I talked about. This is the inclusive teaching who's in class form tool. You can go there, go to the supplementary material and pull it up if you want to see all the questions there. And then some of the other things that I've cited. And then I'd love to share that again in March 2024, our next book's coming out, Enhancing Inclusive Instruction. It's going to be focused on students' perspective. So we surveyed students from a diversity of identity types and just to get a sense of what their instructors thought made a more inclusive classroom so that we had their voice. And then also some of the pitfalls. What are the things that they should avoid, right? We should avoid in teaching students as well. So I always like to say inclusive teaching, it's critical. It's a critical instructional competency, really. It really is in higher education and beyond. So always fight the good fight, be more inclusive in your teaching. This stuff matters. This stuff is so important to us and it's important to our learners. So please, I'd love to just pause there and stop and see if there's any questions. So if you'd like to, oh yes, and also make sure that you have access. Okay, I thought I shared it with everybody, but I must not have. So thank you so much for letting me know. So you should be able to access it now. You might have to reload your window as well. So questions, and I think there were some in the Q&A, or at least there's one in the Q&A. Do you have any suggestions for making mentorship incentives inclusive without making students feel tokenized? Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, so I'm guessing, and you can let me know if this is not interpreting correctly, but being able to reach out to certain students and be their mentors, is that what I'm guessing that's kind of what you might be getting at in this type of question, and without feeling tokenized. Yeah, so it's always nice when the mentee reaches out to you, right? Because then you're like, it's their initiation, but it's not always necessarily going to happen. I think you can always just share that you are a resource for students. Like some students don't really realize how much their instructors might care, might want to take the time. They sometimes think they're too busy. But when you say it, like, I'm happy to mentor you or share these things for you. If you want to know more about this, etc., just let me know, stop by my office, do this. And I think those informal things can go a really long way with students, and that won't make them feel tokenized unless you like specifically call them out and say, just because it's a student, etc. But if you already have a reason to talk to them, or if you want to just, share something with them after class, saying something like that and opening the door can really be a powerful way to setting up at least a mentoring relationship. And of course, they can always choose whether to further that relationship with you. But that's one way to really think about kind of, avoiding tokenization for students. Great question. All right, I'd love to see if there's any other questions. Actually, I know we're at time, but I'm happy to take one more if there are any. And if they're not, I think we can conclude. Great, I'm glad that the sharing worked. Yeah, thank you.
Dr. Addy, I would like to thank you very much for your wonderful presentation today. I found it extremely informative.
My pleasure. It was so great to be here. I love talking about this, and thank you so much, everyone, for engaging with this. It's so critical for our students. So thank you for taking the time today.
And before we leave, I would like to introduce Dr. Veronica Huggins, who is the director of the Center for Social Justice Education. Dr. Huggins, tell us a little bit about your role in that and the role it plays in the university.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I had a little technical issues there. So I'm the new Center for Social Justice Education Director, and I'm really excited, especially to be a part of efforts as such. And I just look forward to carrying a torch when we talk about inclusivity, collaborating more on campus and in the community to help students see that it takes a collaborative effort beyond the learning environment, and just trying to increase my knowledge in implementing the strategies that you've shared. So I really enjoyed it, and I gained a lot of nuggets.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Huggins. And does anybody have any questions for either Dr. Addy or Dr. Huggins before we sign off for today? Okay. I want to thank everybody that participated. I know that more were registered. I'm sorry that they were not able to be here with us today. And Dr. Addy, you really did give us many resources and again, some wonderful information that we can now build upon.
My pleasure. Thank you all again.
Yeah, thank you for being here, and sorry for the technical difficulties. This is my first webinar being.
No worries. I'm glad that you were here to support it.
Yep.
Okay, I guess we will sign off.
Thank you. Y'all have a great week.